Welcome. My name's Holly Metcalf. I serve as the Director for Peace with Justice for the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society. I'm also the co-convener of the Interfaith Working Group on Drone Warfare, and I'm joined today by my other co-convener, Nate Hostler from Church of the Brethren. This is the third webinar in a series of three. We're hoping that today we can put what we've learned into action. So in the first webinar, we focused on the human costs of drone strikes, including the effects on the countries where strikes occur and the implications for U.S. service members that are involved in drone warfare. In the second webinar, we focused on the ethical, legal, and theological considerations that are raised by the expanded use of drones in warfare. In this webinar, we're going to hear from our panelists about ongoing advocacy efforts and ways to put the knowledge that we've learned into action. So we have a great panel today. We're going to start with presentations from our panelists. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Kevin Snow. Kevin serves as the Program Assistant for Militarism and Human Rights at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And he's going to talk to us a little bit today about faith-based advocacy in DC on drone warfare. After Kevin speaks, we're going to turn it over to Elizabeth Beavers. Elizabeth is a national security legal scholar and a strategist for peace and security advocacy. She has expertise on national security law, anti-militarist foreign policy, and progressive advocacy. So we're happy to have her with us today. And then finally today, we're going to hear from Adote Akwi, who currently serves as the Interim Chief Collaboration Officer for Amnesty International USA, and who also has lots of expertise as a political analyst, as an advocate, as a campaigner on civil, political, economic, and social rights. So we're excited to have our panelists here today. The structure for today's webinar, we're going to start with presentations from each of the panelists, and then the panelists are going to chat with each other a little bit, and we expect that portion to last about 45 minutes. While they're talking, if you have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section, in the Q&A portion down at the bottom. And after we have that part, we'll turn to Q&A after about 45 minutes today. And we have until 11:15 today to do Q&A. We had heard from folks that our last webinar was a little bit short. We wanted to give a little more time today to the panelists to share their expertise. So that's the plan for today. We're grateful that you guys have joined us. We're grateful to have the panelists here with us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As Holly mentioned, I work as a program assistant for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, a Quaker nonprofit lobbying organization in DC. In my work, I lobby on issues stemming from the global war on terror that began following the 9/11 attacks. And as part of that work, we of course encounter the specter of drones and drone warfare frequently. They've become a central part of the global war on terror and in militaries all over the world. So in this discussion, I want to briefly go over how drones became a part of U.S. foreign policy and national security, the challenges and opportunities for lobbying on this issue, and the value of a faith-based perspective, both to address the issue itself and to be an advocate for change. So to start, it's important to set how we even got here. Drones have been a part of the U.S. counterterrorism wars since at least 2001 and have been deployed by all four administrations in the last 2 decades. The Bush administration used them first in Afghanistan, later expanding operations, sometimes discreetly, to Pakistan and Yemen. Under President Obama, the use of drones increased massively. By the end of his term, his administration was responsible for over 90% of all drone strikes up to that point, which would only increase under subsequent administrations. These operations were run by both the Defense Department and the CIA, and strikes were expanded to Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. All of this happened outside of the sight of the American public, except for sporadic media reports on civilian casualties and accidental killings. Eventually, through enough pressure built up on the Obama administration to force them to implement new guidance for lethal operations conducted outside of war zones, which included those drone operations. This guidance required the president to personally authorize many of these strikes. It also heightened the standard for conducting a strike, including requiring near certainty of no civilian harm. The Obama administration also released an executive order requiring public reporting on strikes that caused civilian casualties outside of war zones. These reforms fell short of those demanded by groups such as our own, including ones like ending the CIA drone program and reviewing prior strikes for harm done to civilians, but still that was progress. Unfortunately, many of those reporting requirements, restrictions, and guidance on drone strikes were removed or weakened during the Trump admin. That administration saw another huge increase in the number of drone strikes carried out and a rise in civilian casualties. While Congress took some action during this time to bring some accountability to drone operations, including allocating $3 million per year for the Pentagon to pay compensation to victims of drone strikes and their families, again, no statutory expectations or laws were put in place to create protections for civilians or others in harm's way from drones. So where does that leave us now under the Biden administration? Well, new guidance on drone strikes, once again, have been put in place for strikes carried out outside of war zones. The guidance has not been publicly released. According to the New York Times, though, it is largely in line with the Obama administration's drone policy. However, the administration has refused to release its new guidance, even with redactions to protect classified information. Both the Trump and Obama administrations were sued and eventually released redacted versions of their drone guidance. And it's disappointing to see that that's likely the same route that it will be required to get the Biden administration to follow through on releasing that. So I wanted to go over all of that background because I think it captures kind of two of the big challenges for advocacy on drones that we need to consider. The first is the public interest in the use of drones has largely subsided. This makes members of Congress feel like it is something that can be ignored, like other aspects of America's war on terror. And the second issue, which really informs this first one, is that the drone debate has become very complex and tied up in other issues around how the United States has conducted its national security policy. It is not really a question anymore about if drones should be used, but how they should be used and regulated. With that in mind, we have to ask, how do we address the challenge now? Or how are we addressing it now? What role do we as faith-based organizations and individuals play in this advocacy? So in my mind, faith-based advocacy on drones is actually very essential. It brings important ethical and moral considerations to a debate often dominated by a cost-benefit analysis. Proponents of drones will argue that they are cost-effective or that they limit harm to U.S. troops. Terms like low cost and surgical strikes are used to argue that drones are more effective than other methods of carrying out targeted killings of terrorism suspects. This is a framing that fully disregards a moral response to these issues, which makes it all the more essential that we bring it. War is not low cost. It exacts a huge moral and humanitarian cost. The convenience of an armed drone is fundamentally its cheapening of human life, its reduction of fundamental human worth to the opportunity cost of ending that life. That sets a tone for our interactions with threats big and small around the world. How easy will it be to just kill a suspected militant and be done with it? That is not a way that we should conduct ourselves on a world stage. And that's an argument that we are very well placed to make. The argument that drones keep U.S. service members out of harm is also a fallacy. Drone operators suffer from emotional disengagement, post-traumatic stress syndrome, emotional exhaustion, and burnout. They suffer moral injury from the killings they are ordered to carry out. Sometimes I'm unsure of whether they are targeting a member of a terrorist group or someone who's been misidentified by a superior. A faith-based perspective also means these are all things that we are able to that I believe that as faith-based organizations, we are very well placed to argue. We're not trying to make an argument based off of what is going to be the most efficient way, but what is the most righteous way to address these sorts of issues. Another thing that is important to mention is the seeking of truth and open dialogue with our decision makers, between decision makers and the public. These drone strikes are carried out with little oversight and in places that most Americans do not know we are even fighting in. People are killed in our name, and we know next to nothing about it, while the legal justifications for these strikes are obscured from the public. That is corrosive to the functioning of society, especially one where government legitimacy is derived from the will of the people. Our Interfaith Drone Coalition references this fact in a letter we sent to Congress back in 2019, urging the end to the CIA drone program, which I'll quote a little bit here. Democracies must debate and take more responsibility for decisions to use violent force. By refusing to acknowledge most of its strikes, the CIA prevents civilian victims from receiving justice and conveys moral responsibility for killing onto an American people who have never been informed about the secret war, nor had their members of Congress vote on it. That's a perspective that I believe we are very well placed to bring. So turning to specific asks that we are currently pursuing in our faith-based advocacy work, we are focusing on 3 efforts. First, we continue to advocate for ending the CIA drone program by transferring this program to the Department of Defense. Second, we are working to increase transparency concerning U.S. drone strikes and other operations involving lethal force, so the American people are properly informed of the actions being undertaken in their name. Third, we are working to repeal or sunset 2 war authorizations that are passed following the 9/11 attacks, and which continue to be used to justify drone strikes and other military operations, often in secret. The voice of faith-based advocates is a huge value add to this work. As I mentioned, FCNL is a Quaker-based organization. We do not have much to leverage over our members of Congress necessarily. We can't make endorsements of candidates or contribute to campaigns, and we don't have a massive email list to sic on congressional offices who might want to ignore us. Instead, we have thousands of enthusiastic, dedicated volunteers throughout the US who are willing to talk with their members of Congress, and we have our voice. We are trusted on Capitol Hill to be truthful, knowledgeable, and always open to polite discussion, even where we disagree. Secular organizations we partner with also recognize the value the faith community brings to this work due to our ability to build relationships with members across the political spectrum. I also want to point out that other initiatives in U.S. policy have been often spearheaded by faith organizations. Things like supporting conscientious objectors or supporting health policy, such as PEPFAR, which was a huge initiative to help address HIV/AIDS throughout the world. That effort was spearheaded by faith-based organizations. So before I turn it over to the next panelist, I want to thank you for your interest in this fairly complex issue. If you want to lobby on this, I recommend focusing on which of the intersecting issues speaks to you. For example, for me, the use of drones by the CIA undermines government accountability and weakens the public's mandate on statecraft. Focusing on transparency addresses both those issues. If you feel called to address this or something else, like payments to victims and their families, or where drones are allowed to operate, then this coalition is an excellent source for ways to be involved. Again, thank you all for being here, and I'll pass it along.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate the way you laid out kind of the history and the faith perspective for us here. Now I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth to tell us a little bit about what do we do with that information, right? Like, okay, we're here, we're on board. What's the next step?
Thanks so much, Holly. And thank you to the Interfaith Drones Working Group for having me. Thank you, Kevin, for what I thought was a really moving set of comments about this issue. What an honor to be on this panel alongside both Adite and Kevin. So thank you all so much for having me. Let me just share my screen really quickly because, some of us are visual and we gotta too many words to hear. We gotta see some of them. So can everybody see my slides here? Yes. Excellent. Okay. All right. So I was asked to share some best practices for congressional advocacy, and I know this is review for so many of you, but I think it's really helpful to visit and revisit the fundamentals from time to time and remind ourselves why we do what we do, how we choose to invest our time and energy in order to make the biggest impact. So let me first answer a question that I get all the time from organizations I work with, people I mentor. It's a question I asked myself when I first started this work about a decade ago. Why would Congress listen to me? Why do they care what we think? Who am I to march into Congress and tell them what to think or what to do? Don't they hear from experts and donors and people with lots of money and power all the time? Why is it even worth telling them what I think? So look, there's no question that there are big and powerful interests who have a lot of influence in Congress, and we are up against mighty forces when we advocate for peace and justice. But good advocacy starts with doing an honest assessment of power and who has it and why, because we have power too. And the truth is that Hill staff cannot do their jobs without outside advocates. both those representing national organizations like those on this call and many of you, as well as those who are grassroots, who are constituents. And I know Adate will talk a bit more about that. So let me just walk through some of the kinds of power that advocates bring to the Hill. So one is expertise. Some organizations have researchers and experts in-house that are the go-to people on a particular subject. Hill staff have to cover a huge array of issues, and it is not possible for them to become top-level experts in absolutely everything their boss, the member of Congress, is going to ask them about or has to vote on or has to speak on or has to respond to. So they depend on outside experts that they trust to get them up to speed in key moments. So that's one source of power. Another is insight into a constituency's concerns. Maybe your organization represents a number of constituents in that member's district or state, if they're a senator, or maybe you are a constituent and you live currently in that member's district. The member depends on constituents to vote and to keep the member in office. So they want to keep them happy. That is the one thing, by the way, that every single member of Congress thinks about all day, every day. It's re-election. So they care very much about keeping constituents happy. And so constituents have a ton of power to rock the boat with just a little effort. So, also, aside from just direct constituents, your organization may represent a particular sector that is of particular importance to this member. I know we're talking about, for example, the faith community, hugely important to a number of members. And they want to know what that sector thinks, but they can't talk to each person individually or keep track of everything going on in those conversations. So you may be the representative of whatever constituency that member cares about, and you can report back and build trust and power that way. Another kind of power is intel. Knowledge is power, right? If you're someone who does a lot of Hill advocacy, you most likely will become friendly with certain staff who share intel with you about the timing of a vote or which members need extra pushing or what the inside information is on a given issue. Again, Hill staff are crazy busy and they may not be up on the latest intel, and you might be able to provide that for them. You might know more than they do about what's going on around the Hill or in various coalition dynamics or whatever it may be. So I know I keep repeating it, but it is such a source of power. Hill staff cannot stay on top of every development. They need to find people on the outside they trust to let them know the latest. And then, of course, members of Congress have their own priorities and initiatives, and they may want your organization or you as a constituent to provide legitimacy or support for those initiatives, and thus to keep they want to keep you and your group happy. So in those cases, they will want to know what's important to you and how you might be able to work with each other when interests align. So these are just a few of the ways that you or your organization might add value, but it's not a comprehensive list. My point is, think critically about where your value add is and where your particular source of power comes from. Let that guide your strategy, and that will maximize your impact. And I should also say, most of my comments are focused on organizations doing advocacy, but many of these principles also apply to constituents doing their own advocacy. And I'll make a couple of distinctions at the end. Okay, so just really quickly, here are kind of generally the 4 phases of a successful Hill advocacy effort. First up, develop a strategy. I know this seems so obvious, but you would be surprised how many people I work with that just jump straight into reaching out to offices and skip this bigger step. So we'll spend a little bit more time on how to create a good strategy. Second, identify your ask and your whip list. Once again, seems very obvious, but I cannot believe how many advocates I work with that don't actually have this firmed up before they start doing their lobbying. It makes all the difference, and we'll discuss why in a second. Thirdly, this is the biggest step that takes the most time and is the bulk of the work. Do the outreach, do the lobby visits, do the phone calls, organize the constituents, whatever it is that needs to be done to do that outreach to the Hill offices. And then lastly, I actually think this is the most important: follow up. Your advocacy is not done after that one lobby meeting. I always joke that like 80% of my job is pinging people like, hey, me again. Just checking back on that thing. What happened on that thing we talked about? Any updates for me? It's only a slight exaggeration, but success does come in the follow-up. So let's dive a little bit more into each of these phases. First up, as you're developing your strategy, take some time to think through your big vision. It doesn't need to be realistic or tangible. It's just really good to ground yourself in that bigger question of why you're doing what you're doing. Sometimes I think we get so caught up in the various policy positions or bills that we forget why they matter in the grand scheme of things. And that's part of why I loved Kevin's comment so much, because he really grounded the various priorities into that bigger vision. So, for example, if you're lobbying on the like Iran nuclear deal, your big vision is not really about the deal. It's about stepping further away from conflict with Iran, or it's preventing a bigger spread of nuclear weapons. It's relieving Iranians of sanctions pressure, keeping more people alive. It's not really about the deal. There's a bigger vision there. On drones, we talked about maybe we're trying to move drones out of CIA control into the military chain of command. That's not really your ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is what? To make the use of force more transparent, more accountable, save more lives. You get what I'm saying. Ground yourself in that bigger vision of why. Okay, so next, do an honest assessment of the factors working for and against you right now. It can be tempting to kind of skip this or just ignore the factors we don't really like. But it's so important to be honest and say, what is on my side right now and what are we working against? Maybe it's the political makeup of Congress, the recent news events, something else. What makes your big vision more or less likely right now? And so then based on that, we draw up a theory of change about how we can get closer to that big vision. And my sort of little template sentence I always use is, if we do what? Get more members to co-sponsor this, get more members to speak out, whatever, then Y will happen. This result will happen. And that gets us closer to the big vision because Z. So that's your theory of change. Spell out why this effort is important and how it gets you there. So, it's a theory of change for a reason. It's theory. We test it. We try it. We might not be right. But that's how change happens, is we test it. So let's quickly talk about the ask and the whip list. These are pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty easy. Most likely you've already alluded to it when you've drafted your theory of change, but go ahead and identify in crystal clear language, what exactly are you asking members of Congress to do? An important note is you really should not have more than one ask in a particular advocacy effort. Although you might have slight variations on it for different tiers, like maybe you're asking Republicans to do one thing and Democrats to do something else, but it should all be in service of the same goal. And along those lines, you can get creative. It doesn't have to be the usual, like co-sponsor this bill or sign this letter or whatever. It can be, but it depends on what's most strategic according to your theory of change. It could be make a statement, tweet something, ask this question at a hearing, author an op-ed, whatever. And for the whip list, I just want to make a quick note. This is your list of offices you're going to reach out to. I actually think this is the most critical part of your planning. These are the offices you want to influence. And too often I see people with these like gigantic whip lists. They just like copy and paste the entire, Progressive Caucus or something over. That's really not helpful. Develop clear criteria for why you're reaching out to each member. A good whip list is really going to focus on members who they're not a yes yet, but they're not a no, but we have reason to think we can get them to yes. It's not usually a great use of time to reach out to members who are already with you or will never be with you, unless your theory of change is that you need people who are with you to be louder or something like that. Don't over extrapolate. Just because a member is great on one issue doesn't mean they're great on another issue by any means. So develop your whip list, be concrete, be clear, make it align with your theory of change. do the outreach. This is so self-explanatory. Reach out to the offices, do those meetings, do those lobby visits. So just some key best practices for a Great Hill meeting. Go back to think about what is your value add. What is that source of power that you bring to the table? Lean on it, emphasize it. If relevant, invite key constituents or coalition partners or validators. Make it clear at the top, what is it you want to talk about? Don't hide the ball. I want to discuss with you this bill and whether your boss might co-sponsor it. I want to talk about whether your boss might make a statement in support of this. Whatever it is, state your ask for first and don't build up to it at the end. And then here's a really key one. Don't launch into like a speech or a set of presentations. I've heard from so many Hill staffers who hate when people do this. They may be totally with you and it can be a short meeting, or maybe they've got a really specific question and everything else is a waste of time. You should ask them first what their boss's current thinking is on this, what concerns they have, what factors they're looking at, and then speak to those instead of coming in with like a set of talks. Take good notes, especially jot down anything that arises as good follow-up material. Again, Hill staff are busy, so they really appreciate if you can chase down information for them. So if they say like, oh, my boss wonders what academics think about this, then jot down, find a good article from a professor to send them, or whatever it is, whatever they mention that might give you a reason to reach back out. And then lastly, gently handle disagreements. Is that it? Yeah. Gently handle disagreements or objections. Definitely do not use this moment to show off your super special high school debating skills. You can gently but clearly push back on anything a staffer says that's like problematic or untrue. But it really isn't productive to stage like a huge heated argument. And then just finish by asking what their priorities are. There might be something they have coming up that you can support on that you didn't even realize. And it's a nice like mutual exchange of goodwill. And then the final phase, follow up, follow up, follow up. Send your thank you email right after. Keep checking in a week or two after. Remind them, sometimes they need a nudge. Don't be afraid of being annoying. Use your discretion, be polite, but be persistent. And they may ultimately say, no, we're not going to support this or whatever. But don't be afraid to use that energy to sort of escalate things and keep it going. Get other people to reach out to them. Maybe somebody needs to write a letter to the editor in their district, whatever it is. That's what you're there for, is to do that follow-up. The visit is almost like the first step, and the follow-up escalates from there. Okay. So then before I hand it over to Adite, who's going to talk much more about this, I do just want to make a super quick note on when it's constituent advocacy, because I've been talking more about those of us who do lobbying for an organization. Just a couple of differences to note, even though a lot of these principles apply. Just some golden rules. Constituents should never reach out to members of Congress who do not represent them. There are no exceptions. I know sometimes people like to do a big, everybody call Nancy Pelosi right now, panic moment, but members don't care about what non-constituents have to say and will at best disregard the outreach, or at worst, dismiss the cause as not being serious. So don't do it. If you want to pressure a member of Congress and you're a constituent, but you don't currently live in their district, organize others who do. That's the best way to go about that. As a general rule, more effort, more impact. In the age of digital media, there are easier and easier ways to do activism, and they can all have value, but generally it's going to have more impact on a congressional office if it takes a little more effort. So signing a digital petition is going to be less impactful than making a phone call, which is going to be less impactful than doing a Zoom lobby visit, which is going to have less impact than publishing an op-ed or a letter to the editor, calling out the member. You get what I'm saying. And then there's strength in numbers. Don't get me wrong. A single constituent can totally get members' attention, especially on foreign policy where they just don't hear about it as often. But you're going to have the most impact by organizing others, joining in with like-minded people of faith, people who are supporting the cause as well. Add your voice to an even louder chorus asking for change. So those are just a few of my best practices I wanted to share with you all. And let me hand it over to Adite from here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Wow, it's a treat to follow Elizabeth and Kevin, because they basically mapped out everything and really made the compelling case. I'm going to start off with a story which I hope will illustrate some of what Elizabeth has just been saying. In 2007, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Stimson Center, and I believe Oxfam, or maybe one other organization, were basically running a campaign for the United States to raise the age limit for the recruitment of individuals into the U.S. Army. In other words, it was an effort to try to get the U.S. to no longer allow the use of child soldiers. And at that point, the United States and one other country still legally had allowed the recruitment of child soldiers, and that country was Myanmar. And one of the key obstacles to that, in addition to the U.S. military, was the late Senator Jesse Helms, who some of you may remember was legendary in terms of his power, I guess a reputation for being a curmudgeon, and basically a lot of things would stop at his door. And of course, the child soldier campaign was running into that. No one would cross Senator Helms, and we were stuck with this dilemma. We couldn't even get a meeting with him for almost a year, or with his staff. And then we got a meeting, and it was almost as if we were given a miracle. We scrambled together and got on the phone. We developed specific talking points that each of us was going to get. We knew that we had at most 15 to 20 minutes with a staff person. And so we knew that we had to go in and be very, very strategic. And, we had child soldiers are immoral. We had child soldiers impact, the economy and create health problems and damage so many countries by their continued usage. We had everything, but we kept our secret point for the very last. So we went in to this meeting with, I can't believe, maybe it was the chief of staff. And I don't think he looked at us for 15 of the 20 minutes that we were in the room. And each of us would very politely, raise our question. UN countries have created this resolution. Nothing. And then in desperation, we went to our Hail Mary, which was US studies have shown that US officers hesitate when they are confronted with child soldiers, thereby increasing the risk that they could be injured. And he looked up and he said, "Tell me more." That was the entry point. And Senator Helms withdrew his hold on the legislation, and you had the Child Soldier Prevention Act being passed in 2008 by President Bush. And while there are many, many flaws, and sadly still many, many millions of child soldiers, the legislation did, we got our legislative goal. And I use that story just to show, first of all, what an experience can be like in a difficult meeting, but what you can get if, one, you have the information, two, if you tailor, you know the audience that you're speaking to, and then three, if you work in coalitions. Elizabeth knows me and Amnesty. We're all about coalitions, because even as big an organization as of us have realized very, very quickly that the people that we are and the institutions that we are going up against most of the time have much more money, much more power, and much more influence with the US government. In some cases, it is the US government than a grassroots organization can do by itself. And more importantly, we can no longer be both the champions of and the representatives of. In other words, you need to have legitimate people from the impacted communities be front and center, and that demands coalition work. So I'm going to run through a couple of things that I think will complement what my two colleagues have said. The first one is, as I said, about information. And here, I come from an organization that does reports that are 20 or 30 pages long. And we keep on telling the people who write the reports, our attention span here in Congress is 5 bullet points, if you're lucky, maybe probably more like 3, or a tweet. And if you can connect with them there, then they may click on your hyperlink and read the longer statements, and et cetera, et cetera. In the end, you are going to be educating them, but the information and the impact of the information and your first step in that door is got to be very precise, to the point, and as Elizabeth said, it's got to have your ask in it. What is it that that member of Congress is going to do? And what is it that that staff person who's looking at their desk with thousands of documents is just looking for one thing to put into his guidance to his member of Congress? He can just say, okay, wait, they want to do something on drones, A, B, C, D. That's it. Information and the distribution of information are incredibly important. And there you don't have to invent the wheel. You do use other sources. You cite them, but you can use them, because that you're not meant to be the source of all information. Kevin's data and his presentation has the statistics, it has the reasons why, and it also makes the compelling argument. So definitely collect and use your data as strategically as possible. I want to talk a little bit about tactics. This may sound counterintuitive, but local is national, international is local. In other words, what you do in your town gets the attention of your member of Congress. In some ways, coming to Washington is only the icing on the cake, or trying to finalize or seal the deal. If you want to actually get the attention of your member of Congress and suddenly have them take your meetings and basically consider you as a very serious actor that they want to listen to, or at least work with, then you want to be making waves in their local newspaper, in their towns, and basically with other organizations that they cannot afford not to pay attention to, because they're their constituents. Now, that is why the local is so important. And in this hypersaturated age of information, tweets, blogs, whatever you want to do it, the very simple act of even writing to the local paper or writing to the members of Congress in handwriting. I know that many people think, no, we don't do that anymore. It does make a difference for congressional staff. It's like, oh, this person is serious. They've taken the time to actually write this. We're not going to dismiss this and put this in the, okay, a fluffy constituents. The international connection is where your information gathering becomes important, because as Kevin said, this use of drones is corrosive. It is literally making war effortless and very quick and to move on. And sadly, we never even get follow-up on what happens after the drone strike. Those places don't rebuild. We are in a world with more and more failing states, more and more destroyed economies, more and more displaced people, and conflict is one of the main drivers of all of that. The use of drones contributes to that. You need to bring those stories, one or two, not again a whole library, but you need to basically show this is what a simple push of a button means, and these people will, and this country will never recover from that. I've mentioned already the issue of collaboration and coalitions. I think this is where the faith-based community has actually always been strong. There has been a fairly consistent presence. Certainly, Amnesty has partnered with faith-based communities on a number of issues, in particular, the situation in Darfur, the situation in the DRC, the famine in the Horn of Africa, and now even around the issues of the conflict in Ethiopia. And that kind of moral principle is incredibly important. We bring at Amnesty a human rights integrity, or a reputation of being impartial and being factual, but you bring the argument that this is not just the sensible thing, it's the right thing to do. And that's very, very important, which means that your partnerships and your coalitions can and should bring other religious faiths into your work, especially around drones, where the cost and the impact of it are so dire. And coalition work is hard. You end up having to find common ground that you can all agree on, and then you have to develop the talking points that nobody should stray from. And then when you go into the meeting, you have to have someone who basically will nudge you from and keep Adite from going off on a tangent or saying something inflammatory. And I can tell you stories where I did exactly what Elizabeth said you shouldn't do, get into an argument and a debate with, in this case, it was with an actual member of Congress. It was the worst meeting of my life. The work of collaboration and coalitions is incredibly important to this work because it is hard, and because the industrial military complex and the corporations behind this are essential to they are such a big part of the US economy that members of Congress will have to find some real backbone and principle to push back and to say this has got to stop. And this legislation will impact that business from going on. I think the other area which we found very important is coordination. In other words, when do you go and how? What is the sequence of events? Which goes to Elizabeth's point about having a strategy and having a timeline. Even what are the events that you can leverage to make a member of Congress more amenable to doing something for you, to meeting with you? When can you give them information that not only raises the profile of the issue, but raises their profile? We have to think creatively, because we are bringing not only the issue along, but we're bringing the member of Congress along. And there has to be something in it for them. Unfortunately, that is the way of the world. People don't do things for complete altruism. There are not enough people in Congress with that mindset. And so you have to think of what will help the member of Congress also in terms of framing the opportunities for them to do something, and to do something in their constituency where their visibility is maximized. I think one other piece, which unfortunately I'm a little jumbled in terms of the information. Elizabeth was talking a little bit about the constituency advocacy and the members of Congress. That research really is important, even if you're going to get it down to a very, very small list. We usually will tell people, you have to not only find the people who are undecided or who are opposed, but you've also got to try and find out who are the people in the committees that actually have jurisdiction over this issue, or who can have jurisdiction over this issue. We have had members of Congress who have been absolutely brilliant and strong on an issue, and they've been in the wrong committee. If you want to get a resolution introduced that's not going to do anything, fine, they can do it for you. But that's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of their time. And you can see that finding someone from your state who is on the right committee takes some real thought and real intel, and how you use it. I think the final thing I would say before hopefully we have a really good Q&A is the importance of your interaction with the staff in that office. A lot of people will tell you, oh, the most important person is the chief of staff. It's not. It's the scheduler. The scheduler gets you into the meetings. The scheduler will put you into voicemail, and you'll never come out of voicemail. The scheduler will pass on your questions and your information. I remember going into a meeting in the House where the scheduler was waiting for me and said, I want you to know that I used to be a member of Amnesty International, and he's really, really excited about doing this. That was worth the meeting right there, of course the meeting went well, but how you interact, simple human courtesy, decency, and that kind of thing really do make a difference. And as Elizabeth said, looking at the staff person and trying to respond to them as opposed to going into lecture. You can have bad meetings like I did, that which, as you can see, still stays in my mind. I did it, and mine was even worse. It was with a senator, and it was in front of board members. So, that's the worst that you can possibly do. Don't go there. But I will stop there, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation about how you guys can really have an impact on this critical issue. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks to all our panelists. I want to remind folks in the audience that we're going to be turning to questions from you guys shortly. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat or in the Q&A section. But we're going to start by giving our panelists a chance to ask each other burning questions. So Kevin, do you want to get us started here?
Sure. And first, thank you both so much for everything you said. It was just it's really just an excellent panel. It's been great hearing both of you talk about this, reminding me of what I've learned, especially through this role and working with FCNL. So I actually wanted to start my first question with Elizabeth. You talked, like we've mentioned, you talked a little bit about constituent lobbying at the end there. I've done a little bit of that before I worked at FCNL, and organizing people in the community can be very difficult. It can be hard to connect why these issues, especially these big international ones, to local level. But like you said, it's very important that we do that. So do you have tips for how do we organize constituents? How do we get people excited, or really, how do we make them even feel empowered to do this kind of work?
Yeah, totally. It's such a challenge. I think that some of the strategies we're talking about, being persistent with members of Congress, applies to organizing as well. The fortune is in the follow-up, and it's totally okay to keep pushing someone or nudging them until they give you an answer. Have an ask. What is it you want them to do? Why does it matter? Why is it important? So I think I have been on either end of that exchange where somebody's like, "Can you please join this thing?" And I'm like, "Sorry, what is this for? Why do I care about this? Like, what does it do?" Versus I've also received requests of like, "Hey, can you join this thing? We're doing it because of this. And if this happens, then here's why it matters." And so having that ask, having that strategy, like these things apply across, like horizontally across organizing as well. The other thing I'm very conscious of is I think sometimes I see peace advocates, how do I say this? Sometimes their theory of change looks like, if I just get all these other people who are excited about this other thing to be excited about my thing instead, then we're going to really succeed. And I think sometimes that's a little problematic because we don't want to co-opt people's genuine energy and excitement. Sometimes I see that happen with like, if we just get the climate movement to work on peace, then everything's great. And like, I think we want to figure out, how do we have an even exchange of support? How do we support what they're working on? If we're making an ask of them, are we open to receiving an ask of us as well? How do we show a connection to what people are already excited about and are already doing? So I think just kind of like laying that groundwork, it's all about mutual trust and relationship building. How do we connect with what people are already excited about? And I think like not only as a constituent lobbyist do you not have to be an expert, but you don't have to have like a personal experience directly on this issue. You can just care about it, and that's totally fine, and that's totally valid. Certainly, some of the rich and powerful who they hear from do not have a personal experience in the things that they're pressuring members of Congress on. So I don't think we need to feel like, my uncle was a drone operator and that's why I care. Like, that's fine. If so, that's great. But it's also totally just fine to morally care about it. So I think tapping into genuine energy where we can, having a strategy, making a clear ask, and being open to mutually reciprocating that support is really the key. May I ask my question of Adite next? Okay, Adite. So, we've been talking a bit about, we even just talked about it here, like there's so many ways for people to get involved in activism and ways that they can express their energy and their excitement. How can national organizations help constituents filter out what is worth their time and energy and what is worth focusing on? and what's not?
Excellent. Because this is, of course, what we have to deal with in Amnesty. How do you keep your members from becoming depressed? Let's be frank. It's a very, very dangerous, dark world. It feels like that at this point, and there's so many issues. There's even a tension between international and domestic, and people are like, "Well, I've got to be present and here because this country is facing its own reckoning." And one of the things that, of course, we all have to have is we have to hold our faith. And here I'm not speaking even in a religious way. I'm speaking about faith in human rights and humans, period. That people deserve and want better things. And no surprise to all of you, there is a lot of wonderful things being done, a lot of energy, a lot of ideas that are being, and people doing things, and it never gets reported. Unfortunately, we only hear all of the negative stuff. We do need to do a better job, all of us, of sharing that. Even if you have an event somewhere in a small town that seems like, okay, they had 5 people, but they had the event. It matters because it's a little bit of positive energy and a little bit of light. This is me speaking personally, but to Elizabeth, but at the larger scale, you've this drone work, as Kevin and Elizabeth have said, it's big business. It's government business. So it's the biggest business you can get. You have to basically show not only the negative consequences, but the positive, small incremental steps in terms of getting accountability and the spotlight shining on it. In other words, what are give yourself some benchmarks along the way to the big goal, which is eventually to really restrict the use of this technology, and not only here by the United States, but globally. And some may even say, no, Aditya, while you're being a wimp, we want to get rid of drones. But I would say that genie is out of the bottle. Responsible use is probably more realistic. But having, showing those kinds of positive actors, and positive actors outside of the United States, I think this is where the connection is very strong. Who are the partners that Kevin and Elizabeth and other organizations know are working on drone strikes? And can you get their stories or what their reports are so that you can actually show what's being done? I think the other is that you have to have regular. One of the best things that we had when we had this campaign, the Child Soldiers campaign, was, we had the monthly meetings, but we also had smaller meetings in between where you literally sat down and said, I am not making any headway on ... And then you brainstorm, and people are like, well, you need to move on to another target or to do something else. Or have you heard about this person? Maybe they can get you into the meeting. So that is why that is, for me, is the power of coalitions, and that's why they outweigh the challenges and the work that they require. I think the final thing, obviously, is that you having members of Congress themselves speak about things, even in a small way, a tweet, or a floor statement, or those kinds of things, really do make a difference for impacted communities. We tend to think of them as, well, that was 5 minutes of a member of Congress's time, even though it takes a lot to even get that. But outside of the United States, in that, whatever that place is that they're speaking to, they can hear it, and it's like, okay, we're not being bombed out of existence in the darkness, and no one knows. So I think that those would be some of the things that you need to do to keep not only the members of your effort inspired and motivated, but also to keep the issue moving forward and that kind of thing. Same thing for members of Congress. They need encouragement too. There are very few who are like, okay, I'm just going to keep on fighting on this and not get any recognition. So we have to be creative about that. I'm going to ask my question to Kevin. And I'm going to ask the big question, which probably all of us have in the room, which is a new Congress. Any thoughts on how to navigate this Congress around this issue? Because to write it off as, well, there's nothing happening in the House is defeatist, I think. But anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is the big question. And that's the question we've been asking ourselves since I think they announced the new House like 3 months ago. So we've definitely been thinking a lot about that. And it is a fair question because there is the question of like, can we make progress? Is progress worthwhile? I think first, as both of you have mentioned, there's multiple ways that members of Congress can make a difference. Even if we can't move legislation forward, we have champions and people in the House and in the Senate who care very deeply about these issues. In fact, I think it was this September, a few representatives actually made a congressional caucus specifically focusing on civilian harm issues and looking at how do we address these issues, including, I think right now it's Jason Crow from Colorado, Sarah Jacobs from California, and I think one or two others. And so first, there's people there. They're willing to take action, to write letters, to make statements. They've done so in the past. So there's movement there. In terms of legislation or how to approach these conversations with, let's say there's an office that we're not sure exactly where they are. We're assuming that they would probably like to keep drones. I think one thing that you can do is try and frame it by, so let me think of how to rephrase this actually a little bit, but try and connect it, take it kind of, I think, I always think like if the specific instance itself is one that might not feel advantageous in the conversation, think of how you can widen out or connect it to another issue. For instance, when we talk about FCNL, for instance, we're opposed to cluster munitions. We think they're bad. They're obviously horrible in terms of the damage to both lives and communities. So how do we talk about that when cluster munitions are approved under US law? Well, we disapprove of their use in the current conflict in Ukraine. Connect it to issues like that. Like, it doesn't just have to be a question of, asking that question, I think, is a good one of, are we justifying behavior that we would condemn elsewhere? Like, do we want to set a standard on this sort of thing? I think that's one argument that you could make. But overall, I think it is just the work of building up support now, building up our champions, understanding who can we maybe see a flip on this situation. And I don't think we should assume that party affiliation alone is going to determine how someone is going to look at these issues, because we have had success getting bipartisan support on these sorts of issues. I mentioned war powers issues. We have Republicans who care very deeply about those issues. We have Democrats who care very deeply on those issues. And it's possible to make that sort of change, but it'll take work. There's no denying that it will take that hard work that's been discussed here today.
Thank you all for those back and forth conversations. As someone who does similar work and does this work on a range of topics, I've also had to restrain myself from wanting to jump in. So I'm not going to try to jump in too much yet, but we do have a few questions and a few kind of places to, I think, tease out some of these pieces. So one, there's a few questions or comments I think that relate to both visibility and understanding the space. And so I'll kind of reframe them slightly, but the panelists can look into the chat if you want to see how it was framed in the other place. So I think one is, if the member or the staff don't want to meet with you, how do you work to build a relationship? So I think there's a piece, I think that sits within a larger question of strategy and coalition building. So I think both, how do we get more people in the room that help build a relationship? And then I think a question for me, which relates to this question around direct action or kind of more dramatic forms of getting attention. How do we understand the broader advocacy space? So as noted, we sit, those of us sit in different organizations or advocacy spaces, but in a related space. So like, should we all be legal scholars? Should we all be direct actionists who are, locking ourselves into the congressional office and, creating a major stir? In this context, we're talking more about the faith-based community. Should we all be theologians? So we all have constituents that are in local congregations. Like, how do you both, Elizabeth talked about mapping out the advocacy strategy. I guess the reverse of that, how do you map out or think about coalition building and coalition kind of dynamics or strengths that each piece brings, and then using those strategically, both for the purpose of changing policy, but also building relationships so that you can affect policy change in the future. I guess I should pick someone that goes to. Maybe I'll first go to Elizabeth though with that, and then maybe Aditya, you can comment on both the question and Elizabeth's initial comments.
Sure. I can try to go first. I think there are a lot of different ways to do this work. And what we've talked about here is mostly direct and indirect congressional advocacy. But as you mentioned, there's people who engage in civil disobedience and boycotts and protests and art and scholarship. And there's all kinds of different things. And I think our question is always like, grounding ourselves in that bigger vision that we talked about, what takes us closer to it and what takes us further away from it. And I think coalitions are at their most successful when they are all rowing towards that big vision, and most unsuccessful when they are not. And if we do not actually agree on what that big vision is, and we don't have a shared theory of change, at least to some respect, even if we don't all engage in the same tactics, if we sort of jointly think like, if we do X, then Y will happen because Z, if we totally disagree on that, we get a little dysfunctional and we become sort of like a collective of people just firing off, various lines of effort that are disconnected. And I hate when that happens, and it does happen sometimes. And sometimes coalitions, we know how it goes, right? Can get really mired and like trying to talk each other into, no, do my thing, no, do my thing. And that's a waste of all our time. We can all row in the same direction and be complementary to one another. If what we're doing is strategic and brings us towards that big vision. If it's just cause like there's this thing we just really want to do, but it's not grounded in that actual strategy. It's maybe not always a great use of time and effort, but I do think we have to be respectful of the various lanes that people occupy, even if they're not the lanes we occupy, or it's not necessarily something we would do. And vice versa. Like, I think that's where we are the most successful. But again, I'm repeating myself, but I'd like, it's so worth saying, what is that bigger vision and what is the theory of how we get there? And from there, it's all just, there's a welcome community of diversity within that, I think.
Aditya, before you go, can I make one comment, not countering Elizabeth, but a piece, and then I'll let you go? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
So I think in relation to the drones work, Elizabeth, I'll give an example of this that is not exactly what you're saying, but I think it relates. And so the Interfaith Working Group on drone warfare addresses and works as a coalition, which clearly is interfaith, so it doesn't necessarily include Aditya, for example, because Amnesty is not faith-based. But even Amnesty has some liaisons who work in relation to faith-based groups. And so it is good for us to know what human rights coalitions who we might not participate directly in, though some of in our group do. So, for example, I believe FCNL directly works in the Human Rights Coalition. So there's sometimes where we keep separate coalitions, so we're not trying to necessarily have the exact same framing. And then there are also, I would say, some organizations who have generally the same approach, but it's valuable to keep some strategic, a slight distance between what they're doing and what we're doing, because being associated with them doesn't necessarily help our cause, but we are working for the same cause. And so it's good to know where those places are and not always try to build the absolute biggest coalition, because there's some value in having slightly different spaces, even if we're working generally towards the same goal. Sorry, Aditya, all the faith-based group is relevant.
No, you're absolutely right, as was Elizabeth. We do. Civil society works best when you have that kind of flexibility in terms of intel coordination and information sharing, and there are strengths that the faith-based community mustn't lose by if it has to join, say, a coalition that does not what's the word? Not accept, but cannot utilize a moral religious argument for something. But that doesn't mean that the two coalitions don't keep each other aware of what they're doing, and try to coordinate or even sequence activities and tactics and outreach. Because in the end, as Elizabeth said, as long as there is that common goal at the top, you're going to be pulling towards the same thing. I remember when we were doing our work on conflict diamonds. I can't even remember the time, but the work on conflict diamonds was an amazing coalition, and it was all grassroots, and it was all people that we all knew. And then we reached a point where we had a huge tactical question of whether to work with the diamond industry or not. And the diamond industry was the part of the problem, but parts of the diamond industry wanted reform just like we did. And I have to say this, it was congressional staff who pulled us in together and said, if either of you want anything, work together, or else don't waste our time. It was literally that blunt. And at that point, I had to go back to my coalition and say, don't shoot the messenger, but ... We are going to be doing on legislation and lobbying with the diamond industry. That meeting, I won't go into it. It was very rough, but the coalition held because there was an understanding that we needed to get that legislation and we needed to do education. And the campaign went on, even if different parts of the coalition did snipe at each other. I think, I think I'll stop there because Nate, I think I've answered. Yeah.
Thank you. We have two other questions. I'm going to half answer one and put it out there. And there's a pretty long question around surveillance drones, which I'll frame a little bit and then also comment on lightly and then turn it to, I'll think about who to turn it to, I guess. So one is on relationships. So if, for example, an office doesn't want to meet with you enough to build a relationship, and so it's hard to get in. I think part of this gets at the coalition question. So on early of the Interfaith Working Group on Drone Warfare, we would often, for example, if it was a bunch of the peace churches going in, we would be sure to highlight that, we have these Catholic groups in our body, or these other interfaith groups, as a way to essentially validate or show that we're a broader coalition than organizations who have very strong anti-war policy. And so we, in demonstrating or kind of talking into that space, that built some space. I think the other piece that's interesting on both for small offices that do advocacy, but also constituents, is that we don't care about just one thing. And so sometimes to Elizabeth's point, you don't want to have too many talking, too many asks. Kind of getting them bunched together can be problematic. But if you really can't get headway, there might be some strategic value of, if you have a connection on one topic, you can kind of use that relationship then to get a meeting on a different topic is a potential way where you can how to get an inroad. I'll let the panelists comment on that. That's kind of initial quick. Another question was around surveillance drones. And so given the deepening and broadening use of drones, and sometimes for surveillance, which is then often, as we're seeing in Ukraine, used for targeting of other forms of military strikes, and how do we think about that? Do those pair, is a surveillance drone equal to a lethal drone? And how do we think about it? Within the Church of the Brethren, what we've typically said is drones that can contribute to lethal strikes or lethal action, though recognizing we're not supportive of general, deep surveillance. Additionally, we've also, this is to the question of narrower comments or narrower areas of focus. We've often focused on the use of lethal drones or surveillance drones for lethal activities outside of areas of active or declared war zone as a sort of a legally different space. In our case, we're opposed to drone use within a sort of active war zone as well, but there's a slightly different argument or slightly different question or set of questions that can take on different nuances in the different spaces. So there's two statements plus two questions there, and I'll let maybe first Kevin, since Elizabeth and Edith did the last two, and then others can jump in, knowing we have about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, in that case, I'll keep this fairly brief. So I think that kind of goes back to that point I made earlier or that we've kind of discussed here in general, which is cat's kind of out of the bag. Drones are a part of modern warfare. They're a part of just kind of society in general, and you're seeing that more and more. I actually checked for a list of legislation like, is there anything on drones right now? Has anything been introduced in the new Congress? And the one thing I found was a bill basically trying to authorize the use of surveillance drones along the southern border. So that's one of those things that we need to look at. It's less so, I think, the use of drones, because I actually think that, like, okay, if this was actually like a plane, if they were using a plane to do that, would I still be opposed to this? Is there something, is there actually a unique factor to the drone, or is the issue itself kind of what we're looking at, and the drone is basically a way of convenience? So I think trying to think of it in that way, is if my opposition is based, because if we look at it from a question of efficiency, because if we're challenging drones from the idea of like, we want you to use them more, basically what you'd be saying if you were just like, I'm opposed to drones, you can't use that argument, but you can oppose the overall, like, you know, the dehumanization of their use, the way that they're being used to target people in distress. I think that is definitely an effective framing and a good way to look at that. Personally, but you know, I'm happy to hear what others their contributions on that as well.
I was going to say really quickly, to me, this goes back to grounding ourselves in the big vision. And on drones work, I always feel like I don't know that drones are actually what we care about. Maybe others disagree. I don't know that I care about drones. I care about people dying unjustly. I care about people's privacy being invaded. And the reason drones matter is because they make those things more likely. An argument that always just like sends me into a fury is like, oh, or, you know, it saves troops' lives or whatever. Like, no. Most of the time, it's not that we're either sending troops or drones. It's that we're sending drones or nothing. And so people are dying at the hands of the U.S. government who otherwise would not die. And so I think it's exactly to Kevin's point about drones along the southern border. I've seen way too much of, particularly during the Trump era, the pushback to like building the wall was like, we don't want to build a wall. We just want to, you know, secure the border in a really smart way, which usually meant extra technology for surveillance and militarism purposes. And so to me, I think, again, we step back, like, what is it that we actually care about? What is that broader vision? Because we are losing as long as we get sucked into like, is this a good drone? Is that a bad drone? Like what we have to kind of focus on is like, what is the policy that we have a problem with? And what's our analysis of power of how to change it?
Aditya, you can tie us up, and then Holly can finish us out and remind us of circulation of information after this.
Sure. I think I would agree with the list. I mean, I come obviously from a group that doesn't have a firm, doesn't take a position on conflict and war, but it does take a position on human rights violations. And so we are sometimes very good in a meeting, and sometimes we're terrible in a meeting. In fact, sometimes I tell people, don't invite us because we will kill the meeting. And that's important for you to work to think of also. Who are the appropriate messengers? Because you're really trying to to build a relationship. And if it starts off with you're educating them about drones, and eventually you get them to the point of, well, how do we tighten oversight and accountability for the use of drones? And then you're moving them on this journey, and you're creating a long time champion. And that's your goal. You do not want one bill and you're out, because they forget. And I think there was a comment in the chat that said that, you know, the lobbyists for the industry and the military are relentless. They don't stop. This is their core function of we need this for security. We need this for security, and this is good for your state because it'll get you jobs if you get a factory and that kind of thing. So we need to keep on doing that and invest in long-term relationships with these members of Congress. I'll end by just saying one thing. The email, there was a question about emails and letters and phone banking and calls. Absolutely critical. That's your in-person individual contact with the staff in that office. It may all sound like it's all technological and everything, but having a constituent take the time and raise it still has to be logged, and it still factors. And it is our power. If we lose it and we don't use it, then we are basically going into the game with only half of our strength, if even. So don't underestimate what may seem mundane, boring, tedious. It really does make a difference. But again, the right information and the right ask and the relationship building always have to be shaping even the talking points for a phone call or the talking points for an email. Just remember those. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank once again all of our panelists. We've had some great information shared here today, and I want to thank everybody who's attending online. We're going to circulate a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. We'll also send along links to the previous 2 webinars, and we have a one-pager that we're hoping that you can use as like a menu of talking points. Choose the pieces that resonate with you, what you think is useful, and then use some of these tips that we learned today and go out and do some of this advocacy work. So thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you.